Hello, and welcome to another episode of Lost in Suikoden Translation, where today we'll be taking a look at how enemy names have been changed through the various localizations and how they struggle to maintain any consistency. What's most striking about these translations is that a lot of them were in English to begin with and still got changed. And because these names change almost every localized game, I'm going to have to mostly refer to them by their Japanese names. As usual, this series contains spoilers. So without further ado, let's get started. Hairballs and Furballs have been in every mainline game and tend to be among the first enemies encountered. In Japanese, the Furball is called Husa Husa and means something tufty or bushy, while the Hairball is called Mosa Mosa, which means something hairy. For the localization of Suikoden 1 and 2, they're called Furfurs and Bonbons, respectively, and while the first makes sense, I don't know what Bonbon is supposed to be referencing. In the remastered 1 and 2, the Bonbon was changed to Furball, but the Furfur remained the same. In Suikoden 3, only the Hairball reappeared, but this time they have a wider array of colors. For the localization, they got changed to Furfly with 2 R's for some reason, which again makes some sense but ignores continuity. For Suikoden 4, both versions reappeared and even threw in some more variations, and the localizer went with a straight translation this time and changed them to Hairball and Furball, and this was kept for Tactics and 5 as well. The enemy known as Target Lady in Japanese appears in most mainline Suikoden titles, but rarely with the same name attached in the localizations. In the Japanese version, it actually says Target Lady in English, written in katakana, but in the first game it got localized as Beast Commander instead. In Suikoden 2, it actually kept the Japanese name and is just known as Target Lady, and the palette swap is correctly translated as Target Girl as well. In the remasters, the names are the same as the originals. They didn't even give them the same name in both games. By the third game, it got a bit weird though. In this game, she's known as Narikwa, and I have no idea what that is supposed to mean. And this is the name they used in 5 as well. Cut bunnies appear in all mainline Suikoden games except 4, but even though their name was already in English in the Japanese versions, the name changed. A lot. In the original Suikoden, it's called a slasher rabbit. In 2, it's a cut rabbit instead. For 3, it changed to Blade Bunny, which was kept for Suikoden 5 and the remasters. The Golem that Luke summons when you first meet him in the original Suikoden is interesting because it is a lower-level version of the clay dolls you later encounter in the Cave of the Past. In Japanese, these share the same name and ID in the code, clay doll. So, in order for the localized version to display 2 different names for the same enemy would require some extra coding. Not that it is a massive undertaking, mind you, but considering that most of the original Suikoden's localization was an exercise in cutting corners, it's a bit surprising they went through the effort, though they didn't repeat it for the remaster. Sickles are an enemy encountered outside the city of Muse in the second game. In Japanese, they're known as Kamaitachi, which is a Japanese yokai that takes the form of a weasel, and are said to ride on dust devils and cut people with their sickle-like claws. The name literally translates as Sickle Weasel, so that's where the localized name comes from. Why they stopped halfway through is a bit of a mystery, though. The palette swap is localized as Leather Cut, but that should have been Razor Cat, as it's once again combining a sharp-cutting tool with an animal. The other palette swap is called a Spiker in the localizations, but in Japanese it's called an Izuna, which is a type of weasel. The random encounters Oannes and Dagon from the first game are known as Fish Monster and Fish God, respectively in Japanese. The localized name Oannes comes from Mesopotamian mythology and was a half-man, half-fish that taught humanity wisdom. Dagon was a Mesopotamian god of fertility and grain, and used to be confused with Oannes, but isn't actually related to fish in any way, so the name doesn't make much sense. The Manwur enemy's name is just an abbreviation of the translated Japanese name, monster flower. What's more interesting about it is that both the monster flower and its palette swap, the eye flower, are actually bugged in the localized Suikoden 2 and can never attack the player. In the Japanese version and the remaster, it still can't attack directly, but it has a very high counterattack rate where most short-range characters will fail to damage it and get damaged themselves instead. Somehow, this function broke for the English version, and it just stands there. The Malifaux can be encountered in both Suikoden 3 and 5, though in Japanese it's known as Kaohashira, which literally translates as face pillar. I have no idea where the localized name came from, but it seems Frenchish. Malifaux itself isn't a word in French, but mal means evil, and faux means fake. Though that doesn't really clear anything up, so they probably just made it up. In the Cave of the Wind, you'll encounter an enemy called Minos in the localization, but in Japanese it's known as Gozu and gets its name from Gozu Meizu, two demons that guard the gates of hell in Japanese mythology. Gozu has the head of an ox, and Meizu, the head of a horse, and their names literally mean oxhead and horsehead. It would appear the localized name is derived from the word minotaur, but considering the rune they drop has the same name in Japanese, but was localized as Gauze. It seems the localizers base the name on the way it looks rather than knowing what it actually means. The kill spider can be encountered in both Suikoden 2 and 3, though in 3 it's called a dokugumo instead, which is just the Japanese name untranslated as it means venomous spider. For the remaster of 2 it was renamed poison spider, but that doesn't really work because when something is poisonous that means it's harmful to eat, while venomous means that it's harmful to be bitten by it. The Big Frog is an enemy that appears in a couple of the games but always looks remarkably different. The Japanese name is just Big Frog in English, written in katakana, but in Suikoden 2 it's localized as Sauroid instead. In 4, it changed shape and got localized as Ogre Frog. When it returned in 5, it changed shape yet again, this time really looking like a big frog but retained the localized name from 4. The enemy called a Ragged One in both the original and remastered version of 2 is known as a Binbugami in Japanese, which is a type of minor god in Japanese folklore that brings misery and poverty to the people it possesses. The name translates as God of Poverty. Originally, these enemies were supposed to steal potch from the player and even have unused sprites for this purpose, but for whatever reason this feature was never finished. Possibly because it would have been incredibly annoying. In Suikoden 2, the palette swap of the creeper enemy is called a Honeysuckle in Japanese, which is also a type of creeper vine. In Japanese it's Suikazura, but the localizers didn't know what that was, and instead translated Suika on its own, which means melon, and then translated Zura, as zoo for reasons only they could answer, ending up with a melon zoo in both the original and remaster localizations. Red Slime is another one of the enemies that already had an English name but still got changed, and in Japanese it's called a Hydrogel. And for some reason the palette swap is known as a Killer Slime in English, but in Japanese it's known as a Creeping Slime. For the remaster, Killer Slime remained the same, but Red Slime got changed to Scarlet Slime instead, which isn't much of a difference. Blight is a bird-type enemy that appears in Suikoden 3 and 5, and in both games it's localized as that. In Japanese, though, the name was already in English and it is known as a pain bird. It's a bit weird that they called it a blight specifically, considering the previous game's major antagonist was called Luca Blight. The enemy localized as Chue Chue in Suikoden 3 is called a batterfly in Japanese, where the name was already in English and is an obvious pun on butterfly. Interestingly, the localized name seems to be derived from the Japanese word for butterfly, which is cho, so I guess we can give them some points for at least changing the name to something that makes some sort of sense for once. The Echidna appears in Gregminster Palace, the last dungeon of the original game, but in the original localization it got mistranslated as Echidna. Echidna is a reference to a monster from Greek mythology that has the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a snake. This was fixed for the remastered version of Suikoden 1. In Suikoden 3, the heroes will come face to face with several enemies called Rinkars while searching for the true elemental runes. Rinkar isn't actually a word, it's just an abbreviation of True Rune Incarnation. Because Suikoden 3 unfortunately has a very stringent character limit, the localization had to resort to using a lot of unfortunate abbreviations, but Rinkar in particular doesn't get picked up as one by most people. So when you're fighting the Fire Rinkar, for example, it's just short for True Fire Rune Incarnation. Crab Punchers appear in various forms and colors in Suikoden 3 as treasure bosses and regular random encounters. They also appear in Suikoden 5, and in both games they're localized to Manticra, whatever that is. In the originals, they're called Kanipanchi, where Kani means crab, and Panchi is the English word punch. The Empusa is a treasure boss in Suikoden 3, but also appears as a late-game random encounter. In the localization, however, it's called Azades, and again, like most made-up names in Suikoden 3's enemy roster, I have no idea what that is supposed to mean. The name in Japanese comes from Greek mythology, where Empusa is a shape-shifting female monster that seduces and feeds on men. The boss summoned by Necklord at North Window in Suikoden 2 is localized as Abomination, but in Japanese it's called Hecatoncheir. Hecatoncheir is another reference to Greek mythology and means hundred-handed one, which goes some way to explain the way it looks, though it has substantially fewer limbs than that. And in the remastered version, the localization still calls it Abomination. The final boss of Suikoden 1 is known as the Golden Hydra in the localized versions, but in Japanese it's called the Golden Dragon. Presumably they changed it to Hydra because it has 3 heads, but the Hydra of Greek mythology actually had a lot more than that, as whenever you cut one off it grew 2 new to replace it. Though in fairness, the Hydra in Suikoden 5 doesn't grow more heads either, and that is actually called a Hydra in Japanese as well. So there we go. That's it for this episode. And no, there's no secret message this time. Well, I guess that sort of counts.